Okay, in part two of this week's content, I'm going to talk about the hipsterification of everything. So I've done a lot of research and written kind of a book about this, about hipsters and bogans and how they're essentially figures of talking about class without talking about class.
Yeah.
They do a lot of work in the media, in popular culture. So the book I wrote around this was, I did some analysis of a bunch of opinion pieces and news reportage on one hand, and kind of various forms of comedy on the other that kind of drew on these figures to kind of often make a lot of critical points about things in ways that were about inequality, about taste, about morals, about consumption. And the critique they were often making were class critiques, but they never obviously mentioned class. So basically the hipsters and bogans become proxies for class. The hipster is a kind of more global figure. The hipsters are all around the world, where things like the bogan tend to have their own local terms, like the chav in the UK and redneck in the US or whatever. The hipster tends to equate with middle class consumer practices and morals and ideas. And the way that they were spoken about in the media was largely kind of ironic and kind of nudge nudge, hip hip, wink wink, they're not that bad, the hipster. And the bogan is definitely much more talked about through symbolic violence messages of, like, you know, they're vulgar and violent and eat the wrong things and do the wrong things and go to the wrong places and all
Drink
that kind
the
of
wrong
stuff.
beer.
Drink the wrong beer, yeah, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, in terms of why that happens, I think, you know, who's writing in the media, who's making comedy films, well, it's people that tend to have tastes more like the hipster. So they tend to have more kind of homology of taste with what's going on there, tend to have more appreciation for that. It's all kind of problems with hipsters, but, like, really they're not that bad. Obviously there's more social distance to the bogan, and therefore there's way more kind of denigration when it comes to that topic, that figure. So that was kind of my research around it. In terms of what's important for what we're looking at here, is that there's been quite a bit of analysis of how the hipster as a figure has been key to some of the gentrification processes that we're talking about. Now, just to clarify here, I don't think there's such thing as a hipster or a bogan. I think they're kind of categories that people hang their own anxieties on about stuff. There's certainly, you know, dudes with stupidly curated beers that are too fixated on where their beer comes from or whatever, and there's certainly blokes that in high beers that drink VB. Whether those people actually should be called hipsters or bogans or not, it's kind of a stereotype in a way. It's a label, but, like, as I point out a lot when I talk about this, I have different people in my life that have called me a hipster or a bogan, right? So it's largely depending on who I'm talking to and what I'm doing. Like, if I'm playing cricket, and I say I'm going to see a band, they call me a hipster. If they seeing a band, I'm saying I'm going to play cricket, they call me a bogan. So these things are kind of make the class categories fuzzy. What the likes of Scott does in this reading, though, is talks about how kind of, if you think about more as hipster as a culture, things that kind of people do and practice rather than as a person. It kind of speaks a lot to these gentrification processes and how what he calls hipster capitalism functions. So that reading is particularly good to have a look at. And he talks about kind of cultural capital, the way people use their cultural capital to get into some of these creative industries. He uses fashion, and Angela McRobbie's work about that is really important. What I also find interesting is that he talks about how particularly more privileged people that have a bit of capital can come in and kind of give a kind of hipsterish cool sheen on old industries.
Yes.
Now, this is things like woodwork and beer brewing and all that kind of
Barbers.
stuff. Yeah, barbers is a good example. There's also in Newcastle. In the reading, he talks about tattooing, which is you know, almost ubiquitous now, and sex work. It's really interesting analysis. So he argues that basically the hipster professes an interest in entrepreneurship and the conversion of cool into commerce. There's a long history of sociological analysis of this, going back to the Frankfurt School, really, in some ways. Thomas Frank wrote an amazing book in the 90s called The Conquest of Cool, which is kind of about 90s alternative culture that gets co-opted and that kind of thing. So yeah, rather than seeing the hipster through the lens of consumption and identity, there's a need to see the hipster also in terms of the neoliberalised entrepreneurial figure, that creative kind of thing that we've been talking about, at the forefront of urban cultural production, promoting the art of living well.
Yes.
Through microbreweries, fashion, tattooing and holistic wellness practices.
It's interesting too if you think what came before the hipster in sort of our society. You think, was it the yuppie? But of course the yuppie wasn't producing anything. The yuppie was just consuming conspicuously.
Yeah.
And so you try to think, well, what other sort of historical precedents are there sort of in the 20th century for this category of people, and it is hard to find one. It is a distinct kind of realm in lots of ways, that they're producers, but they're cool, they're creative, but then they're also quite discerning, and so there's this kind of very kind of complex.
And much of the writing about them, though, is how they're kind of also full of shit.
Yes.
That it's all kind of performativity, and in the end, it's just about kind of promoting yourself or making money. And the concerns of, say, greenwashing something, or it tends to be more. The politics tend to be secondary to the kind of self-promotion and stuff like that as well.
And I think as a performance, it's also for many people a necessary performance to show they're equipped for this job. That they will be a good worker in this kind of environment. That they may have written a whole lot of poems, but unless they present this way, no one's going to think they're very good, right? I think that the performance is also generates some anxiety for people to live up to as well in our current economy in lots of ways. That if they show up in a suit, they're not going to get the same reaction as they would if they show up like this.
Naomi Klein talks about in No Logo, like 20 years ago, about turning up to these kind of creative job interviews with a skateboard and that kind of stuff is much better. Penny Jane Burke has got a really interesting critique of this as well in research she did about young people in the UK trying to get into the fashion industry. And what they have to do is these interviews and talk about their tastes and stuff like that. But inevitably it was kind of, middle-class white people judging everyone, and therefore middle-class white tastes were the ones who were being rewarded. And there was these kind of actual processes and examples of the panels kind of scoffing at young black women who wanted to do popular things rather than be the next
alternative
Picasso or something.
Very
so this kind of class, race, and gender inequalities are embedded in the kind of micro day-to-day changes of how this stuff happens.
And I think it's important for a course like this that again there are material consequences for these things. The hipster's not just a funny figure now that we can mock or see evidence in particular products, but it does shape employment markets. It shapes maybe what salary people get, how seriously they're taken, how authentic they appear.
And authenticity is particularly important here. So of course, that blurriness between work and play, as we've been talking about a little bit, is kind of really important when we think about this kind of stuff. And I'll talk about it in a minute. It's kind of, is the hipster dead? I mean, like, we don't hear about it as much anymore, but certainly the hipster aesthetic has kind of, become almost ubiquitous. So, you know it when you see it, right? So it's not even so much the kind of grungy milk crate kind of cafe thing anymore. It's this kind of more austere thing where they're not non-places per se, like we've spoken about already in the course, but this kind of sterile aesthetic has kind of spread around, and all those suburbs that I mentioned earlier on, if you go to those places, it is kind of like it's a bit McDonald-ish or airport lounges. They all have the same kind of thing going on, even if there's kind of quirky differences and that kind of thing going on.
Multi-use, multi-purpose space and minimal decoration because it's the people who provide the aesthetic.
So, this kind of spread. There's a couple of links to articles there about airspace or the millennial or startup aesthetic that you can kind of check out some really good examples of that. But what kind of happens in these places too is it becomes increasingly difficult in some ways to tell the difference between what's a leisure space and a workspace. Leisure spaces are taking on more work aesthetics because people go to cafes and work, and they actually start providing for those people sometimes. And workspaces are trying to take on some of this kind of cool stuff. Google being the famous example, WeWork being the famous, massively failed example. Yet, the actual human resources research seems to point out that work in those spaces isn't necessarily more efficient or productive. There's all kinds of weird stuff that goes on.
You stop people leaving at the end of the day, stop them leaving to do other activities in the middle of the day, but you don't necessarily make them more productive by keeping them there. And there's a forced sociality to it that I think that horrifies both of us as individuals, but more generally about this idea that you must do everything together. You must be, everything's a group activity, which again means you're always performing.
It's kind of this legislated enthusiasm kind of thing. Where, So, we'll move on to the next one. So, is the hipster dead? Well, probably. Like, they're not really in the media as much anymore. The bogan still is, but not so much the hipster. It was basically ubiquitous from the early 2000s through to about 2015. I mean, when I was doing the research, there was just too much. There's just like stories in like stuff every day about this kind of
I
thing.
think there was even a series on SBS that was a
Yeah,
guide to
there's a
being a
bunch of
hipster
them.
or something like that.
Yeah.
And
And
it
there
was
was
sort of mocking, but also interested.
Yeah,
in
and the
the
Bondi
phenomenon.
hipsters started parodying in it, even though they kind of seem very much like hipsters themselves. And
Yes.
that's the thing about hipsters, right? The self-knowing irony,
the irony
thing
is
is like
so deep.
never ending.
Yeah.
So, again, that's about around that culture. So, while the hipsters doesn't be reported on anymore, I would say that's largely because, you know, that hipster aesthetic and those kind of hipster capitalist culture things are now the norm. They're mainstream now. They're not kind of alternative to anything anymore. And they go through a bunch of stuff. There's like that normcore thing that happened that was apparently a kind of rebellion against the hipster, like, you know, where it was all of a sudden, you know, cool to wear Kmart clothes or whatever. But those things are often kind of a bit of a joke. But really, there's been a co-optation process. Boutique beers now are everywhere. They're even in, you know, the Workers' Club. You know, or if they're not boutique anymore, the boutique ones are being bought by the multinational companies. And
Or they make
kind of
their own, what looks like a
Version
boutique
of it,
craft
yeah.
beer with a different name, but same brewing conglomerate.
Yep. Coffee culture, pretty much ubiquitous. You know, turmeric lattes are everywhere. Men with heavily kind of curated beers and, you know, lots of ironic and tattoos. These things are just kind of mainstream culture now. They're not really alternative. So, again, there's a really interesting book about this called Art After the Hipster. Hill talks about today, given the increasing impotence of the term hipster, like, you know, what does it actually mean anymore? Proclamations of cultural discernment are overshadowed by ethical considerations of identity, making palpable an uncertainty about our capacity to untangle capitalism's thirst for reinvention from the artist's thirst from subverting norms. Essentially what he's talking about there is like, yeah, if creativity is nothing but about the profit motive, you know, what do we do in terms of cultural activities to, you know, not be that, to rebel, to subvert, to try and make something else? The ultimate critique here is the hipster has kind of destroyed the possibility of culture being alternative in a sense. Now, I tend to kind of react against those things because I think they're often kind of middle-class old people talk about not knowing what's going on now. It's kind of that thing like, young people today don't have political music.
Yes.
Well, they really do. You just don't know
don't
about it
see it.
anymore, and it's, you know, that kind of thing. So there's always that kind of generational thing that's going on around that. But like, I think there's kind of, you know, some purchase in what Hill's talking about here in terms of what's currently, you know, mainstream culture.
Yeah. And I think we've always got to open ourselves to the possibility that subversion is always happening.
Yeah.
It's just no longer in the place where we once saw it. It's moved somewhere else.
That's right.
And somewhere else and somewhere else.
And in the gentrification processes, if you're thinking about a city, it's tended to be moving further and further and further out as people who are actually creative and have things to say about the world can't afford to live closer anymore, and they move further and further out. Okay, so in terms of this hipster gentrification, what tends to happen though is, you know, in terms of resistance, what we're talking about, is there can be things that prop up where, you know, the current people that live there or the people being pushed out will resist and rebel, and there's been lots of interesting examples of protests and stuff like that around the world. One particularly around the Serial Killer Cafe on Brick Lane in London, which I walked past in 2015. It's quite ridiculous. On this kind of amazing, you know, very famous, you know, street, Brick Lane, where this kind of essentially, you know, cafes and bars and restaurants, you know, from ethnicities all around the world. It's an amazing place, but is, you know, rather rapidly being gentrified, that area. There was this kind of two relatively wealthy, very hipsterish looking dudes opened this cafe there where they were selling, you know, bowls of cornflakes for £6 or whatever. And this was seen as kind of like a beacon almost of these problems of what's going on, and the really long-standing, very lefty group Class War organised protests around this. I think it was in 2016 or 17, and there was all kind of these, you know, uprisings about it. The window over the place was kind of damaged and all this kind of stuff. As Legrand, in that really good article, talks about, instances like this kind of become struggles and debates over the morals of what's going on in terms of particular who gets to live in the city and who doesn't. So where in some respects the dominant representations of figures kind of like the hipster show places to be vibrant and like, you know, of economic development, good things happening, that's not how it's experienced for the people being pushed out, and they tend to react negatively against it. And this, you can see the kind of debates over legitimacy and authenticity being playing out through those things. Okay, I'll leave this section there.